Welcome to the Unstoppable Freedom Podcast. This is Jimmy Page. Hey, welcome back for part 2 of our discussion about capitalism. I think you're going to find some really interesting tools to understand capitalism better and to make a compelling argument for why capitalism is inextricably woven into the fabric of America, and it's the only moral system. Enjoy. I think that gets young people's attention when they actually link how hard they're working and the value of what they're getting. But one of the things that you mentioned was our schools, right? And kids are impressionable. So if you're handing over your kids into a government system that doesn't value capitalism, that doesn't value in many ways now competition or striving to be your very best, it really is kind of dumbing this whole thing down. They are at risk for adopting an ideology that's inconsistent with human flourishing. And one of the things that I just saw that you did a little bit of a piece on the Colorado Education Association. You alluded to this. The largest teachers union in Colorado adopted what I would consider an explicitly anti-capitalism resolution. And you say it's a good thing. I know you don't totally think it's a good thing, but they certainly did expose their hand, right? And I want our listeners to know that there is an ideology that is completely exposed or opposed to capitalism. And not only that, they are demonizing capitalism. They're saying that they're kind of redefining capitalism as the exploitation of everything, from kids to land to labor and resources. How would you say, well, I guess two things. One is, what do you think about that? And then two is, if you're a parent out here and you're hearing that our school systems are kind of in direct opposition to most of our values, what do you do about it?
Well, what I think about it, as I mentioned, is in the piece that I wrote and when I've talked about it, I think it's really positive development because my view is that we should be truth seekers. All of us should be seeking, to understand the world we live in and the people we live with better and seek the truth. And so the truth is the CEA, the Colorado Educational Association, and the national affiliate as well, the national organization, and most of the educational establishment that we have has been implicitly for decades, as I mentioned before, holding these views. And whenever you can kind of obfuscate or kind of couch or sell your views in a way that seems like it appeals to people, Americanism, so to speak, then it's not good. It doesn't work. Whenever you have that kind of compromise between the way people view the world, sort of a mixture that way, then it works to the person who's hiding something behind their back. But whenever you have someone who says, no, let's be clear about what we believe, and the CEA now coming out and saying, look, we're against capitalism. That's a good development in the sense that now people will go, well, am I against capitalism? Am I for capitalism? What is this capitalism they're even talking about? Now they're taking advantage of, again, decades of people having capitalism misidentified and vilified. And so they're cashing in on that. Those seeds have been planted and they're cashing in on that because there are a lot of parents out there who might go, oh yeah, I guess the school system is saying we're against capitalism. And, I guess I am too, even though I'm maybe dependent upon it or my livelihood is dependent upon it or every value in the world. I mean, they won't say that explicitly, but now maybe they'll think about it.
Yes.
The task for us who are defenders of freedom, we have to be more clear ourselves about, okay, what are we for? What are we exactly for? And I think it's a really good development if we can actually be clear on both sides and say, what are you for? What are you against? If we're both seeking truth. So what should we do about it? I mean, the whole point is that we should be more clear about what the fundamental of capitalism is. It's not fundamentally, just profit seeking. It's not fundamentally competition. It's not state capitalism. It's not crony capitalism. Capitalism is that system that protects rights. And if we can be clear on that, what we mean by protecting rights, what we mean by the proper role of government in that sense, what we mean by rights itself, then we'll win. We'll win the argument. And that's like, okay, now we're turning the corner on this last 100 years of misidentification of the concepts.
Yeah, I love that. And I think this really does kind of feed into this idea that we've got to get better on messaging. It's not, you can't always be against everything. You have to have compelling reasons why you're for something. And I honestly think, one of the things I mentioned to you in the class is, boy, we need a flashcard kind of approach to capitalism, the top 5 things that capitalism is, so that we can properly communicate it, so that it becomes compelling. Like, it makes people think, wow, I had no idea that's what capitalism is. I had no idea that's what capitalism results in. You've said it, even on this podcast, you've said that the best way to defend capitalism is a moral defense. What are we for? Why is this the only moral option? What are we for?
Yeah, we're for people having a right to their own life. We're for self-ownership and self-government. And self-ownership means people get to do what they want with their lives, even if we don't like it. You and I, Jimmy, might have a certain view about what moral behavior is, and make an observation about another individual, saying that person isn't being moral. But as long as there's almost like a meta level or a higher level. I'm not sure it's the right way to say it, but it's another level of saying morality. The most moral thing you can do is just allow people to be free and discover the truth for themselves. You can try to persuade them, but so, the key is understanding that each individual is an end in themselves, and they get to decide, even if they're making the wrong decisions by my definition, as long as they're not violating someone else's rights. I have to allow them to live that way.
Yeah. And one of the things, so as a person of faith, as kind of a man that walks with God, I'm a Christian. I have this idea that, there is a benefit to living my life in such a way, to having these opportunities to prosper and to profit, if you will, which has really taken on such a negative idea. But the idea is that the more money, the more resource, money's just a tool. Right? The more resources I have, the more good in theory, in the hands of a moral man or a moral woman. Boy, money is a very, very positive force for good. And I think in terms of generosity. Part of the reason that I want to prosper is so that I can be more generous, so that I can help people in need. But one of the distinctions you've always made is that's voluntary. That's driven by your conscience. That's driven by your own moral code, so to speak. The government is acting not out of freedom and a moral code. They're actually acting out of force when they take money from you in taxes and they give it to someone else. When government is limited, then I have more resources to be more generous, which leads me to the next thing is, you've said this at the very beginning. Capitalism has lifted more people out of poverty than any other system. And I would say that's a pretty good moral defense. Talk a little bit about generosity. Talk a little bit about the reason for prosperity for the benefit of others.
Well, that whole issue that I bring up about capitalism lifting more people out of poverty as a moral defense, I don't think that's the primary thing that we should focus on. It's a fact. Whenever you allow people to be more free, you have this a virtuous spiral upward in terms of both, as I said, both material wealth, but also spiritual well-being. But the moral defense can't be about, okay, it does lift people out of poverty. I pose this question a lot of times to people. What if it didn't? Let's say that you had a social system where, again, this is like a thought experiment, but if you said you had a social system where the government, owned lots of the property, and you had a collectivist system, and it actually did lift people out of poverty as well, maybe on the same scale as a more free system, does that mean it's as moral? And I say no. It's not primarily because it lifts people out of poverty. It's primarily because it allows people to be free. It allows each individual their own life, their own self-ownership. It's a consequence that that so happens to be that lifts more people out of poverty and has that virtuous spiral. But the key focus has to be on the individual, not the collective, and not lifting people out of poverty. It does do that, and that's an important thing for people to understand historically, because there's so many arguments that are misrepresentation of the history of freedom and capitalism. So it's really crucial that people understand that. But it's more important, in my view, that people understand the morality is based upon self-ownership, self-government.
Yeah, I like that.
I'm not sure I answered your question, though. I wanted to make sure that point.
Yeah. No, I think you did. I think you did, because I think that lifting people out of poverty can be a byproduct, and it obviously is a byproduct. But the primary one is that government should not be in the business of forcing people to do things against their conscience, and really in many ways against their own good. And
that's
I think
the other thing I was going to mention.
Yeah,
you mentioned government shouldn't be in the business of force, but in one sense, that's the only business that government should be and can be in, right? Because if you don't have force, then you have voluntary behavior. People trading with each other or saying, "No, I'm not going to trade with you today. Goodbye. I'm not going to associate with you today. I have nothing to do with you today." Government this is something George Washington said really succinctly. Government is force. That's all it is. That's all it can be. That's all it ever could be. And the question is, what do you want? What's the proper use of force? And again, as it sounds repetitive, but the proper use of force is only in defense of rights, only in protection of rights. Now, it becomes more complicated when you're talking about, a specific police scenario, right? What is the job of the cop in that scenario? What is the job of the military? The job of the military is, in a sense, the same thing. Protect our rights as Americans, protect our right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. But when does that military force get employed to do that? And that gets more complicated. But in principle, it is just that idea of government is force, and the only proper government is the one that uses force to protect rights.
That's right. Well, that's interesting. You jogged a thought in my mind just about the current push for reparations. Right now, this, of course, there's a lot of history to this. There's a lot of, we have a rough history in this area of subjugating people, and every single one of us would condemn parts of our history. The question now of reparations is taking money by force from one group of people and giving it to another. How do reparations fit into this whole idea of capitalism and economics and individual rights?
Well, so you mentioned a couple things there. Reparations, as it's currently being proposed, is a moral abomination. It's absolutely wrong to think you can hold people accountable who had nothing to do with slavery whatsoever. You can hold those people accountable and redistribute their property to people who were never slaves in the first place. I mean, that's just a moral abomination. You mentioned that we have a history, and I hope you mean that really broadly. People oftentimes think we Americans have this history of subjugating other people, but we is much broader than that. All of human history has that history. Americans made it a problem. And and certainly that tradition was abhorrent all around the world as it was in America. But America's the only one who actually said, no, we really have a problem we have to solve. And so the idea of slavery is as old as mankind. I mean, and it isn't necessarily always associated with race. I mean, it is in some places, and it certainly was in the American South, and the whole slavery history in the U.S. was based on subjugating Black people. But the genesis of that was Black people, oftentimes African Americans, selling other African Americans to be shipped over to work plantations in North America. And the other fact that people don't know, I mean, this doesn't justify anything. Slavery itself should always and everywhere be condemned, morally condemned, and eradicated whenever it can be. But there were free Black people, free African Americans in the United States at that time who owned Black slaves themselves. Slavery has been with us since the beginning of time, and it's only once you said, "Wait, no, every individual," and then anthropologically understanding what we mean by that, every person, whether they're black, white, female, male, whatever their gender is, whatever their race is, whatever their religion is, they're an individual. They're a precious individual, and they have a right to their own life. And it's morally wrong to subjugate them. So that's sort of my view, or I think the proper role or proper view of racism from a capitalist standpoint. Capitalism is the system that actually ended up helping to eradicate racism. Now, when you go back to the whole idea of reparations, if there were a way you could say, okay, we can identify specifically people who were wronged and specifically people who were benefited from this, but we're talking about hundreds of years now. It's impossible to do that, and all you would do is perpetrate a greater injustice to have the kind of reparations that California and maybe San Francisco and places like that are contemplating. It would be really destructive and take us backwards, not forward.
Yeah, and I think it does continue to create more division between race, unnecessary division between us, and I think that's part of. To be honest, it's part of the propaganda machine, right? That's part of we're in an election cycle right now, and there is an awakening of many people to see that our political parties are in many ways not working for us anymore. And so now this whole campaign of division again, where, it's part of the process. It feels like it's part of the process every 2 to 4 years. So let's shift gears just a little bit back to kind of some basic economic things. Why are price controls like rent controls, caps on drug prices, minimum wage, why are these things a bad idea? And what negative, sometimes unintended consequences do they have?
Well, those kinds of controls, I mean, there's two parts to it. One is practically they are a real interrupter, or they interrupt the whole flow of information. Prices are basically a conduit of information and values. When I say, this car is worth this price to me, it's saying to the person who's a producer of a car and a distributor of a car and lots of other people in the supply chain, this is what matters to me. I'm willing to pay this much for it. It's a conveyance of my values. And if you're using force, which is what a price control would be, I mean, a price control by a government says, look, you can't charge that much for that car. It's basically wiping out my mind and the mind of the car seller. We can't come together and use our values to come together as an agreement in a win-win situation. We have somebody who's interfering with our value system, and it causes all kinds of distortions in the marketplace, misallocations of capital. That's the practical argument. It doesn't work because you're interfering with people's values and what they care about. The moral is that you're using force to substitute some bureaucrat's judgment, or some bureaucrat who says he speaks for the collective good, their judgment for the person who has the property, the person who actually has the dollars to buy the car, and the person who has the car to sell for the dollars. So you're interrupting that value exchange, and you end up with misallocations of capital and ultimately destruction of wealth. I mean, whenever you have wealth that gets misapplied and mistraded and values get mixed up, you end up having less wealth because it gets destroyed over time.
Yeah. And I was thinking in terms of the unintended consequences, right? I know as a business owner, and I know a lot of people that own their own businesses, this idea of the minimum wage and the negative consequences of that, quote unquote, the negative unintended consequences are generally that people get less hours. We have extended unemployment because businesses can't afford the labor anymore, or we have increases in prices that the customer is not willing to pay. And those costs always get passed on to the customer. So it's kind of like a big balloon. You squeeze one end of the balloon, the other end gets bigger. That's kind of what these controls, these artificial controls do. And they have all kinds of unintended consequences. From the very beginning, you've talked about individual rights and property ownership. And I think it's such a foundational element of capitalism and the American way. The World Economic Forum, they are pushing what I would consider a globalist agenda through the United Nations. Interestingly enough, the United Nations is just one big globalist tool. And one of their Agenda 2030 goals is, quote, that you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. Why is this collectivist movement so destructive to human flourishing, and what do we do about it?
Well, there's a lot to say about that. I mean, I'm in favor of globalization. I'm not in favor of a globalist kind of government or that kind of thing. I mean, we don't have anywhere close to rational government in my state and county, let alone my federal government, let alone on a worldwide basis. But I am in favor of globalization in the sense of more freedom to trade with more individuals. There's all kinds of, I mean, we've got 8 billion people on this planet, and that means 8 billion potentially creative, benevolent minds that offer value to me. And so I think it's really crucial that we distinguish between free trade amongst people and nations all over the world versus this push, like you're saying, and it is a Marxist push to say, let's us be the people who help you figure out that you don't need any property, and we're going to make it so you're going to be happier. It's a con, right? I mean,
right.
And what should we do about it? I mean, the young people, as you mentioned before, are the most susceptible to this kind of argument, at least in an innocent way. There are people out there who are, pushing this globalist agenda from the World Economic Forum who are really diabolical and want to have more control over people. But there are young people who advocate for it themselves, and I think in many ways innocence. But the way you convince them is just to address their mind honestly and say, okay, how about if I take your stuff? You find out what they value. A lot of times people really are attached to their phones or their clothes as young people. I'm going to take your clothes. You don't need that property. You'll be happier without it. Very quickly, you're going to find that people are attached in some way or another and have a great appreciation for their property. And
Yes.
you want to make the further case is that, if you're talking about at an extreme level, giving up your property, that means giving up your mind and your body and allowing some collectivist force, Whether it's a World Economic Forum or the UN or even our own federal government, to decide what's best for you in terms of even your own body and mind, how you work, do you get to choose your career, or should the World Economic Forum decide, okay, this is what you're best at, and look, you're going to be happier without having any control over your own vocation or who you marry or whatever it might be. Young people won't fall for that. I mean, that's
right.
The problem is that there is that ideology that is infecting and affecting many of our leaders, even people who are nominally for markets. They're falling for some of that as saying, this is the way to solve some of these bigger problems that we have, versus the real solution, having more innovation and more individual freedom.
Yeah. And I have a lot of friends in countries that are socialist, some that are communistic, all of which are collectivist. And they will tell you that nothing does more damage to a human being than when things are imposed upon them, when they don't have choices about the jobs that they're going to have, when there's zero incentive for them to work harder because there's no reward. It is a plague. And then, we've talked a lot about this idea that home ownership, the ownership of property, actually leads to more prosperity, more generational wealth than just about anything else. So, and our kids are getting this because they're right now in a situation where they can't, in many ways, afford to buy property. And they're realizing they're paying rent and getting no accumulation of wealth from that property. They're starting to say, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. I don't like it at all. And that's good news, I think. When this collectivist stuff starts to happen to people and they experience it, oftentimes they don't like it very much. One of those areas is taxation. I've spent a lot of time thinking about how much tax we actually pay. We're taxed when we make money. We're taxed when we spend it. We're taxed when we invest it, when we save it, when we grow it. And we're even taxed when we die. I mean, it is diabolical. I think back to the patriots who dumped tea into the harbor because of a little itty bitty tax on tea. And now we're talking about, in some estimations, we're being taxed up to 50% of our real income. That should concern us, shouldn't it? And is there a pathway out of this exorbitant taxation?
Well, the only pathway out that I see is that people have you have a critical mass of people who will reject taxation as such as force. Is people coming to the idea that no, there is no moral tax. Now, that's a difficult thing to say. Well, we have it. We're putting up with it all over the place. And you mentioned before, a young person getting their first paycheck and seeing that happen and going, this isn't right. I don't like it. But very quickly, just going, well, I got to get along to play along. This is the society I'm born in, and this is how it works. And then further buying the error of saying, well, we got to have government. I can't live in a free society without military and aircraft carriers and police forces and teachers and the EPA protecting me and all this kind of stuff. So they buy into that. I got to pay for this. Somebody's got to pay for it, so I have to pay for it. And I wouldn't do it I wouldn't do it voluntarily. So they've got to forcibly extract it from me. So you have to dig down and say, well, would you not pay for things that are valuable? Your own protection, your own rights protection. Would you pay for a government that was in its proper role? That's one thing, is that to have people think more clearly about that. But they've got to reject at its root the idea of force. That forcing people to do things against their better judgment is a good thing. That's just a moral precept we have to fight. It's a long battle, but it can be won. The founders themselves were winning it. They didn't have, in my view, quite enough of a philosophical foundation to really completely eradicate the idea of force from human relationships. But they certainly, did better than anybody else, and we have to build upon that foundation. We have to rediscover that whole idea of self-ownership, meaning that a government's job isn't to take money from you or take your property. It's at that level that the battle has to be won. And there's a further thing of saying, okay, how do we do this on a practical level with all the things that we have that are supported by tax dollars today? How would they, we have to show a grander vision of how, if they really are valuable, and some of what our government does provide value, it would be provided even better in a marketplace. I mean, the classic example is, postal service. I mean, we still have a postal service. It's a legacy thing. But if you ask someone, if you really needed your mail delivered or your postal service done correctly, would you rather have it done by the U.S. Post Office or would you rather have it done by FedEx? Most people would say, I want the private company to get my stuff when I need it, right?
Yes. Yeah. And I can't tell you how many times our mail system has failed to deliver things that I've sent or were expecting in the mail. I mean, I can't even tell you, but I can count on less than two fingers the amount of times I don't get it from those private companies that make their living on reliability.
Yeah, and every time you actually point examples like that out, anyone who's honest will say, this is a more practically a more effective system for delivering value. But they still have that hang up of saying, but we owe it to each other. We have to have this force because we have to have this collective good. The whole idea of collective good is a really confusing concept for people, and it's what oftentimes destroys a person's ability to think clearly about it.
Yeah. And I think this force, of taking money, especially by taxes. I mean, you think about it, we've got property taxes, we've got tax on gas. Here in Colorado, it's over 25 cents per gallon. So when you add that up, you're like, wait a minute, that's a lot of money. When I go to and from the airport, I'm paying tolls on those roadways. Those are taxes. There are fees on everything. I love the way our government gets around taxes by calling things fees. Fees get attached to just about everything now. I think part of that is we need to elect people that believe in a more limited role of government, less taxation, so that we can roll back some of this stuff. But Mike, as we conclude, what are some resources that you recommend to parents and families? We've got a lot of people that are listening that want to be able to communicate the benefits of capitalism in a simple and easy to understand way. I mean, I read Atlas Shrugged. That book is, I don't even know, 1,000 pages. It is compelling. Most families probably aren't going to read that. Do you have any other kind of simplified resources that you would recommend to people?
Well, one resource is to listen to you more often, right? I think people should tune into the both entertainment and information that you're providing, Jimmy. And I would say as well, they should listen to our Defenders of Capitalism podcast, My Capital Idea. There's a lot of really good resources. You mentioned Atlas Shrugged and Ayn Rand. She wrote lots of nonfiction that people should read that isn't nearly as long or daunting as reading Atlas Shrugged. There's in a sense a boiled down version of Atlas Shrugged that's nonfiction. It doesn't have the story, and sometimes we argue about whether we should actually have that. I mean, stories are compelling, and that's oftentimes what makes Atlas Shrugged so life changing for many people, is because they see it as, in reality, or at least in a story setting, they can see the actual implications. But there's a book called Capitalism: The Unknown Ideal by Ayn Rand, which I would recommend. And there's lots of other nonfiction that she wrote. There's other great economists and resources in the field. Certainly, the Foundation for Economic Education is mostly a force for good. Cato Institute. There's a lot of people out there who are fighting for freedom, and on a political level saying, here's the principle we should be, and at root have that principle of non-initiation of force and the proper role of government being to protect rights. There's a number of political institutions, but I would say the biggest thing I would recommend people do is understand their founding better. I mean, the American founders had an incredible achievement, and it's underappreciated today. And unfortunately, it's not taught well in schools. So people have to take it upon themselves to really rediscover that achievement of what the founders did. I mean, they should read the Federalist Papers. They should read the founding documents, the Declaration and the Constitution, and the whole context. I mean, there's a really good book by a guy named Brad Thompson I would recommend, Understand the American Mind at the time of the Revolution. He basically goes back, 10 to 15 years, 20 years even before 1776, and shows the sort of seeds that were being planted there, the genesis of some of the ideas of what came together in 1776, how they came to these conclusions of, no, we don't only want to reject England, but we want to have a positive understanding, a positive a role for government of saying, here's what a proper government does. So there's a lot of great resources out there. I know I'm rambling about it. I could probably come up with even a better list.
Well, that's excellent. And we'll put all those resources in the notes for the podcast as well. But Mike, I wanted to thank you. Your podcast is exceptional. The Capital Idea, it's absolutely exceptional. We will put a link to that in our notes as well. Thank you for investing so much in leaders within Colorado and leaders really around the nation to understand our founding principles, to understand capitalism in a way that's compelling so that we can make the argument. I appreciate your time today, my friend. God bless you.
Jimmy, I really appreciate the opportunity. I appreciate the good work that you're doing. Thank you so much.